Rach, Nat, are you ready to learn about smallpox?
I'm ready.
I'm ready, but I really want to hear about that cow called Blossom.
Well, we will find out about Blossom in a bit. But first, let's talk about smallpox. Smallpox was an incredibly deadly disease, first recorded in 1500 BC, so like 3,500 years ago. And it was one of the most deadly diseases in human history. In the 18th century, it was killing 400,000 Europeans, just Europeans, every single year. And last century, so in the 20th century, it killed 300 million people.
Wow.
It's incredibly dangerous. Incredibly dangerous. It would kill about 30% of the people that got it. And a lot of the people who didn't die would also get things like permanent scarring, and they'd also go blind occasionally.
30%, holy shit.
Yes, so it killed 30% of people who got it. Yeah, it had initial symptoms like the flu, so you got like a fever, lethargy, those sorts of things. And then eventually you'd get a skin rash, and you'd get like pustules everywhere. And that's what would cause all of the scarring. It sort of transmitted essentially by people being in the same place, because one of the places where you would get your pustules would be in the mouth. And so you would get your pustules and then you'd cough, and then that would spread it around in the room you're in. So it was not great to be in the same place as someone who had it, because it basically meant you were going to get it. Obviously, this was so large in the presence of the world for so many thousands of years that they didn't just let it happen. There were some things that they tried to do to try and prevent all of the deaths. And we're going to talk a bit about that, and then we're going to talk a bit about the vaccine coming after that as well. So, let's talk variolation, which is a very fancy word. It's a very, very fancy word, variolation. Variolation is essentially the before vaccination thing. It was the precursor to vaccination. It was a way of enabling people to get immunity to smallpox by essentially getting it, but not as dangerously as if they just got it normally. There are a couple of different ways that people got variolation throughout the world. Here is the Chinese method of having variolation. This was done to a child. Essentially, what they would do is they would get the scabs of a mild smallpox sufferer, and then they'd dry them out in the sun. These scabs, they'd dry out in the sun until they were lovely and dry. Lovely dry scabs.
My favourite kind.
Yeah, best kind of scabs, right? And then they'd grind up those scabs with some grain, and then they'd stick that grain scab mixture into a pipe, and then they'd smoke the pipe, and smoke the smoke from the pipe into the nostrils of children, essentially.
It's just like the disease has to be like so prevalent and scary and like deadly for people to think, okay, what we need to do is try and make sure that our little tiny baby children get a mild version now so they don't get it really bad. Like,
yeah. A real memory you're gonna have.
To risk the risk of doing something like that and thinking about like what the consequences should be when you don't necessarily have like so much, I don't know, to be the first people coming up with those kinds of like experiments and trialing them.
Yeah.
Nat, do you remember when we were children and they used to blow pox smoke up our noses? Those are the days. That's what life is like. Like, oh, we had pox smoke blown up our noses when we were kids. You have to have it too.
Well, the thing is, like, I remember going to a chickenpox party.
That's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
And nowadays, kids don't do that because they have a chickenpox vaccine.
Right.
So, like, kids don't get chicken. Obviously, kids do get chickenpox, but it's not like everybody I knew when I was a child got chickenpox. It was just a thing that you got. And now nobody gets it. Like, it's a rare thing for a child to get chickenpox, and that's such an incredible,
Right, like they want you to get it as a kid, because if you get it when you're older, it can be really, really dangerous, but it's like harmless as a kid.
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, I went to a chickenpox party and got incredibly badly. I've still got marks on my hand. You probably can't see it on the camera. It's not focusing. It's focusing on my face. But there's a mark there. That red mark is a chickenpox scar.
Wow.
Right.
That's like, even knowing the risk of like a kid getting it badly is less scary still than the idea of like getting it at a later stage when it could be really, really dangerous.
I had the mumps when I was a kid, and the doctor came round and he phoned the nurse to come and have a look, because people get vaccines, so you're not going to see it again.
Yeah. Well, this Chinese method of variolation was quite ritualized, apparently. So boy children and girl children got different nostrils there. The smoke got blown up, and it was like all very fancy. What you'd get is a very mild version of it. You'd still be ill for a month, and there was still a chance of you getting seriously ill and getting a proper form of smallpox. But the chance of you dying by having this kind of variolation was 1% as opposed to 30%. Which is an enormous,
that's really amazing.
absolutely enormous change.
I'm so curious about how that works. Is it just because is it the same reason? It's just like they're dead pox.
Yeah, it is kind of the same reason as what you sort of know what that vaccine is. Of like, you get a mild form, a small version of it that then gives you the immunity. It's obviously not quite as advanced as modern day vaccines. So the side effects are obviously much more serious by doing variolation. But this was just a way that they managed to make it sort of not as many kids died, essentially. In Europe, we love Europe. They also did variolation, but they did it a slightly different way. They soaked rags in the pus of smallpox sufferers. So they soaked a rag in the pus of smallpox sufferers, and then wrapped that rag round the arm of someone who'd been cut. So you'd cut the arm, and then put the rag around the arm. This was a little bit more deadly for Europeans, and I think it's mostly in the UK, actually, I think. There were a couple of reasons for that. One of them was that they dug quite deep. They did a big, deep cut, which is, in an age before sterilisation, was basically meant you're going to get an infection as well.
Right, so not even from the risk of the disease, there's actually just a risk of, like, just getting a bacterial infection. Yeah.
And also they would do bloodletting as well, because of course they did. Why else would you not bloodlet someone? So there's this sort of double whammy of draining someone of all of their blood and also doing a massive cut, and not necessarily using mild sufferers of smallpox for the smallpox donation, meant that doing variolation this way was a little bit more deadly than the Chinese way. They did eventually, over time, start to realise that if you just do a small scratch and use mild forms and you don't do the bloodletting, it's a little bit safer and people don't die quite as much.
If you just don't cut them really deep in the arm, probably.
Yeah. And you'd get, like, variolators, basically, would travel around the country and just do variolation to people.
High risk, high reward mentality.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes,
yes.
like, as well, like, thinking of, like, the placebo effect, sometimes people have more trust in something that seems scarier and like it could have worse side effects. They have more trust that it's actually worth doing, and, like, even if it's really counterintuitive, like, if you list worse side effects on a placebo, sometimes people think it will be more, like, will respond as if it's been more effective in treating the thing that it's meant to treat.
Well, one of the sufferers of variolation who didn't have a great time was a man named Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner was a man who was a doctor/surgeon, because of course, if you're in the 18th century, you can be a doctor/surgeon/animal biologist/ballooner. He was born in
detective fiction writer.
He was born in Berkeley, Gloucestershire, or Gloucestershire if you're American. By the way, I only did this presentation specifically to make that joke. And as I say, his variolation was not mild. He had a really bad case of smallpox because of his variolation. Because of that, he had a lifelong hatred of variolation as a thing, as something that people did. And so being a doctor, being a surgeon, having an understanding of animal biology meant that he was able to put some of those skills to use. One of the things that people noticed was that milkmaids very rarely got smallpox. They did, however, get cowpox. And people they knew this, they kind of understood why it was like that. They sort of think, oh, it must be related. But no one had really put two and two together that cowpox made them immune to smallpox. Cowpox was essentially a much milder form of smallpox to people. You didn't die quite as much. You just got some pustules around your hands
more like
and stuff.
Chickenpox.
Yeah, a bit more like chickenpox than smallpox. And consequently, Jenner hypothesized that the cowpox made them immune to the smallpox. And to test his hypothesis, what he did was he scraped the pus from cowpox blisters from the hands of a milkmaid called Sarah Nelms. Now, Sarah Nelms got her cowpox from a cow called Blossom.
Aww.
I think that's so lovely. I think cows are so lovely.
It's wild to me that like Blossom is the name of a cow. To me, it's like if I were to name a cow, Blossom would be on the top 10.
Yeah. Blossom is a wonderful cow name.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect cow name.
But like this is from 300 years ago. 300 years ago, people still, also thought that Blossom was a cow name.
They were
wild,
just like,
right?
Yeah, cows have peaceful lives. It's a blossom.
Yeah.
So he scraped these cowpox blisters, got all the pus from Sarah Nelms' hands that she'd got from doing all of her milkmaiding. You can see a picture here of some cowpox udders. So they look very similar to what the smallpox pustules looked like as well. And what he did was he went and borrowed the son of his gardener. So he just went to his gardener and went, you, I need your boy, basically. And got his 8-year-old son of his gardener called, a boy called James Phipps. And he basically injected the pus from the cowpox pustules into the kid. And he just got the kid and injected this random kid. Didn't tell his daddy was going to do this. There was no consent forms. He just injected this random child with cowpox.
Not that it would necessarily have been better if the kid was forced into it by his father than by a stranger.
It would have. It is worse. It is worse. They didn't even tell us.
Yeah.
It's a wild thing to do. It's really, really wild. And the thing is, it only bloody worked.
Just as well.
It's such a wild thing. You just wouldn't get a child and inject some random stuff to this child.
This is a guy who got smallpox because of someone giving him a treatment to try and prevent him getting smallpox, and now he's just experimenting with a child.
Yeah.
It is utterly, utterly wild, but it worked, and consequently, the world now had a smallpox vaccine, because it essentially meant that the person getting this injection of the cowpox didn't get smallpox. This meant that essentially smallpox was kind of removed from life. It still was a problem all over the world, but there was the ability then, if there was an outbreak of smallpox somewhere, that you could go into the village or the small town that had this outbreak and vaccinate every single person, and all of a sudden that outbreak is done now, it's finished. Or you could give it to doctors so that they won't get it when they're treating the people that have smallpox, etc. But it was still a problem. It's still obviously killing hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century. And part of that is because, like, places with low infrastructure, the places that didn't have any money, because of reasons. Let's just put it that way. Colonialism. It essentially meant that there was hope. There was hope. But it was still killing hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century. So, eventually, the world got together and decided, we are going to eliminate smallpox.
Hell yeah.
It's amazing. It's an amazing story, essentially, because it started with the Pan American Health Organization, essentially saying that they wanted to eliminate smallpox on the American continents. And they did it. They eliminated smallpox all across North and South America by vaccinating when there was outbreaks, being very, very proactive, and just going everywhere they can to stop these smallpox outbreaks. A few years later, the USSR essentially called on the rest of the world to eliminate smallpox all across the globe. The US, obviously, this was the height of the Cold War, essentially, or at least the start of the Cold War, I guess, decided, hang on, Russia can't beat us to it, so we're going to do that as well. So it essentially was kind of a bit like
this is the arms race I want to hear about.
Yeah. Like, which one of us is going to eliminate the virus? Which one of us is the best superpower, essentially, as it kind of turned into. And 500 million vaccines were sort of dosed for the next 20 years, essentially, around the world. By 1975, basically everywhere in the world except for the Horn of Africa was eradicated. Smallpox just didn't exist there. There were a couple of reasons why that last place to get it eliminated in was Africa, and particularly the Horn of Africa. You can obviously take a few guesses.
Racism.
Yeah, let's be fair. There were a couple of reasons, basically. Yeah, there was also bad infrastructure. There was civil wars that had happened, basically making it incredibly hard for medics to get out there and vaccinate people when they needed to. But eventually, by 1979, just before Christmas, 1979...
What a sweet present.
Yeah. Smallpox was declared eradicated by the World Health Organization. Yes. Woo!
Amazing.
This doesn't mean that smallpox doesn't exist. Obviously, there are vials of it in labs, and people are certain that, like, the various different superpowers all have stashes somewhere that they can use as biological weapons, because of course they bloody do. But you're not going to get it in the wild. You're not going to catch smallpox. And how amazing is that?
Yeah.
How amazing is it that, like, this disease that killed 300 million people last century just doesn't kill anybody anymore?
Absolutely incredible.
Can you imagine that?
All the suffering everyone's going through with the pandemic right now, but, like, actually how fortunate we are to have so many, like, absolutely, like, horrendous diseases that we just don't have to worry about anymore. Like, literally, we just got rid of it. Like, what an amazing human achievement. It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, now that we've vaccinated against smallpox, let's see in the last 250 years what we have managed to find vaccines for now.
Ooh.
We now have vaccines for tetanus, polio, influenza, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, rubella, Hib, measles, whooping cough, mumps, rotavirus, chickenpox, diphtheria, rabies, cholera, Japanese encephalitis, yellow fever, shingles, typhoid, tuberculosis, anthrax, and pertussis.
Hell yeah.
You know when people are like, pick the 6 people you'd like to have at your ideal dinner party, and it's like, look at this list. How can you pick just 6 of them?
And of course, COVID-19.
Yes.
Which we have an vaccine for. Yes. How fantastic is that?
Our friend Lily, her mum, had one of the first, was having one of the testing the vaccination. So, like, yeah, thanks to her and everyone else who's like risked themselves to help create the COVID-19 vaccination. Like, absolutely incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a truly amazing achievement, and it all started with a cow called Blossom.
I've heard that we have to be worried about melting permafrost and diseases trapped therein.
Yeah.